Ne.
A bo kdo po italijansko vprašal?
Jaz kot lahko italijanščino.
Ajde, da te vidimo.
Materni jezik, težko angliščino. Alright guys, so I actually prepared for this talk in English, and English is a bit easier for me since I'm a bit half-blood, half Croatian, half Slovenian, so I don't want to make funny mistakes in this talk. So, alright, let's begin. Hello everyone, my name is Mitja Orlič, and I'm currently PHP engineer at D-Labs, and it says senior here. I really don't identify myself as senior, but I believe that all the experience I've got so far should make me that. So yeah, a bit about myself. I've been at D-Labs since February 2013, so it's now a bit more than 3 years that I'm here. Collectively, I have a bit more than 7 years experience building PHP apps. And the last 2 years, I've been really enjoying working with JavaScript and learning about Angular and essentially hacking that out. For my time at D-Labs, I've been working at BOF. I invite you all to check this site out. It's great if you're interested in fashion, and it's any of your interest here. I don't have a shirt today, so I'm just a developer here. So yeah, I've been leading a team of 3 to 5 people in the last half a year through various projects, and yeah, this is short about me. So let me start by telling you about the way that I came to D-Labs and why we are doing stuff with Symfony. So when I came at D-Labs, it was 3 years ago, I was working at the company before. We were essentially hacking out PHP apps, and hacking out is a term that I refer to as putting everything in a single file, having a request coming to that file, and then having a bunch of crappy code that is managing everything. I was working for the Slovenian public system, as you might probably refer to. It's still in that way, I think, most of the code. And yeah, obviously that was my first year since I left college, and I tried to pursue a career to find out more about PHP and how to properly develop on the web. So yeah, this is why I started with PHP. It was at that company that we were working with PHP. So after a few years at that company, I realized that that's not the right way to do things. By a quick amount of time, I realized that what I was doing is not right, it's not what the community is doing, something's wrong, and I started to look at frameworks. So there were really a lot of frameworks, and if anyone of you is familiar with Typo3, I started working with Typo3, and that really wasn't as good of an experience as anyone knows. The community there is really something that I would describe just as horrible. And so yeah, I was looking for something else. I was looking for something new, and this is where I found Symfony, and I just essentially went to the site and started reading through. I was amazed. The first thing that amazed me on Symfony was that they had documentation, but the second thing that was amazing was that the documentation was versioned. I couldn't believe that there was versioning for such a thing as documentation. That like blew my mind. I knew that, okay, this is something new and I need to try it. So let me not brag more about why Symfony. This is one of the best reasons, but there are really many more. So they have a really good release flow. They know when and how they're going to release new stuff. They always think about backwards compatibility, so it's really easy to upgrade, and they have really a lot of components that I believe almost all of the frameworks out there in PHP are using. So I know that even Zend is using some components of Symfony. There is Drupal, there is even the mega popular Laravel that people are using. So yeah, Symfony is kind of really good. So let me proceed quickly to tell you a bit more about it. So I don't want to tell you a lot of this, but I assume that all of you know what this is, the model view controller pattern. Do you all know what this is?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so when I started to code, I had no idea about this, and I'm not ashamed to tell you this, but 4 to 5 years ago, I was learning about this, and at my faculty it was like, wow, this is this huge pattern, you need to learn it, and you read through the theory, and it's very complicated. Essentially, this diagram explains everything, right? It's very simple. So you structure your code in 3 different places. You have a view that's going to come to the user, a user is going to use a controller to do something, and then a view is going to give it back. It's really, really simple. But in my old company, this really wasn't something we could use. So let's move away from there. So another thing that Symfony has when we talk about MVC as the fundamental basis, Symfony has a really good component for talking about interacting with you with HTTP. So for when a user makes a request and you're expected to give him a response, Symfony uses a component called the HTTP kernel, which is a really great component, and oh, look at me citing Donald Trump. It has a really a defined set of flows, which I believe that Zend, I know that Node.js and Express and other frameworks use as middleware. Symfony, I believe, started a bit earlier than middleware was kind of a big thing, so they use events. So they use the event dispatcher pattern. If you know about it, I think it's pretty straightforward. So at the core of this, I don't want to go through all the flow, but it's really simple. You have a request, it gets to a controller, the controller renders a view, there is a response, and then there is a terminate, which I won't mention here. But this one I want to focus a bit on. So a user makes a request to Symfony, and how it usually works is that there are a bunch of event listeners that are hooked up to the kernel request event. And I highlighted this in this kind of half circle shape, which are like layers to get into an application. So it's one of the first ones is the router. So the router essentially tells you, hey, I've made a request to this route, tell me where I need to go. So I go to that specific controller. But before you get to that controller, you have still a layer that it's the firewall. The firewall essentially takes care of the authentication of the user, so that you know who the user is when he makes a request. So when I started to learn Symfony, all of these things were not really clear to me. I was like skimming through everything, and I wanted to learn it. I wanted to know how to code properly. So what I did initially, I went to the Symfony demo application, to their website, to GitHub, and this, by the way, is not what it was at the time. This is from yesterday, and it got updated a few days ago. So what I found out looking at, very simple, you probably all went through the blog controller example. Everybody goes through those, right? This one, I just want to pinpoint something in the demo application, which is still odd to me why things are done in a certain way. So this file is the block controller PHP. You are really invited to take a look at the Symfony 2 demo app. But let's look at these functions. This is just one function in the whole file. There are many more functions. But if you take a look, this function is doing lots of things. Even though there are lots of comments and there are some abstractions, this function is taking a request inside, it's saving it's validating that the request is okay, it's calling doctrine, which is an abstraction to save stuff to the database, and then when it's done, it's doing some event dispatching, and it's redirecting you to some place, right? So when I started to learn about these things, this was a bit weird to me, and then what I did next is I went to look through the community, and this bundle takes lots of hatred, but I believe is one of the most used bundles out there, and the most downloaded one in the whole community, so I think it's really worthwhile mentioning. But when I went to look into that bundle, and this code is also from yesterday, so it means that it's the latest version. I know there are talks to make a new one, but I just want to pinpoint something really important here. So take a look on the left. There is a register action here. So look at how bigger that one got, using the same principle. It's the same thing again. It's validating something, making sure that you can register, and creating a user. Then another one which got a bit crazy to me was the send email action, and this one is sent from the reset controller. I believe all of you might know how resetting your password works like, right? So what you do, you enter an email, you click on submit, and what happens is it's trying to validate if the email exists. It sends the email back to the user, and that's what this action is supposed to be doing. So one of the first rules that I learned even in the old company, doing my own code and nagging on people while they're writing code in a certain way, was a function should never be bigger than your screen, right? It should never go over your screen. So when I saw this action here, I was kind of blown away. So this is the best that this awesome framework can do. I was like, this is wrong, right? So let me make just a small analogy before I continue. So this, to me, is like, so you're going to the doctors, right? And imagine the router being the door of the hospital. So you get in, and So the router directs you to the right area. So let's say surgery or whatever. So you get to surgery and you open the door. So the doctor is supposed to take your blood, fix your stuff, I don't know, do everything, perform surgery, and let you out. So it kind of doesn't make so much sense to me. You know, it's all that Symfony is doing here is directing you, giving you all these super tools, and you just get to one place to do everything. It doesn't seem like a good solution. So this analogy and this problem was something that actually happened even in VLabs. So when we started coding, we also didn't know a lot about this. We were kind of doing the same thing that Symfony was doing. We had a bit of talks with Symfony 2. We have organized, and nobody kind of pinpointed a better solution. So I'll give you just an example of a problem. And this is only one example, and there are really hundreds more. So just imagine that you want to access or you want to reset password for a user, but you don't want to do it to HTTP. Okay, you might not want to do that exactly, but you might want to create a new user and you don't want to do it to HTTP. How can you do it? You can potentially define the controller as a service. They actually do something like that in the documentation, and then you can call it straight away, and you need to pass it a response. So how the heck do you pass a request to the console while not being in an HTTP environment? It's really complicated. It's not the way to go. So how did we tackle it on BOF? So it took us actually quite a bit of time. So it's from 2 to 3 years to perfect our code. It didn't happen after a day that we suddenly realized that this doesn't work, but no, it took several iterations. So one of the good things that happened on BOF, we got a new CTO. He was really knowledgeable about code. He was working at AOL previously, and he gave us some directions. So one of the biggest points that he gave us was CQRS, which I'll talk about later, but the core fundamental was using domain-driven design and design patterns to try to solve all of this mess that is in the controller, as we saw. So what is domain-driven design anyway? So if you go and look at Wikipedia for domain-driven design, I actually read the manifesto before I came to the labs because I was very afraid. They had this DDD written in the job specification. By the way, nobody knew exactly what DDD was, so don't be scared when they put something like this in the job application. It's just so you must be familiar with it. You don't need to know what exactly it is. So essentially, let me try to explain this. No, I won't. This is very complicated. So it talks about value object, about aggregates, about entities. I never understood the difference between one or the other. It was really complicated. If you start to learning this from zero and nobody shows you this, it really can get complicated. And I think it scares lots of young developers away. So I'm not going to talk you tell you about DDD in this way, but I'm going to tell you about DDD in our domain. So what DDD means at BOF and in our team. So DDD essentially for us is you need to encapsulate the business logic into some services that make sense. The very important second thing is that we have single responsibility. So each service has only one responsibility. You wouldn't have a service that does 3 things. You have a service that does 1 thing. The next thing is architecture, which is very important to us, how you structure your code, where you place some files. The consistency is something that's really important, which we have a bit of trouble on because we are always upgrading, finding better ways to do stuff. It's really hard to be consistent with old, but consistency is something that for us is really important. So this is part of DDD for us. We also have some product-based modules. What this means is essentially the last line says it better. We try to name stuff in the best way so that we can then talk with product managers on how we essentially, when we develop new features, how essentially this, to keep a common language. So we know exactly what we are talking about when they are mentioning, I don't know, that the user needs to register. As I mentioned previously, we will call that exactly that. We won't use some different naming in code that we would in product. And the last thing, I guess it's really easy for developers to spot and get right on work on what they need to do. So just quickly about domain-based architecture. So what this means for us is how we structure our code. So we have a really defined way to structure the code and where we put stuff. So since Symfony provides the bundle is like a module in Angular or in any other framework, probably Zen, I don't know how it's called, the bundle in Zen.
Bundle module.
Is a module, yeah. Okay, so it's like a module where you keep your stuff. So we try to make domain-based modules. So for example, you have users, so your big domain is users. You would call a user domain bundle, and inside that you would do everything you do with the user, right? You would change the user details, you would update the password, you would register a new user. So all of these things that I mentioned for us are a concept of subdomains, which I mentioned here. So what essentially a subdomain is a folder inside, the top folder inside of the domain bundle, where all our services live in. So everything that's required for that specific subdomain or feature to live in. The next thing inside of subdomains that we have inside of them would be business logic. So you have lots of services that are doing different stuff, and our CTO advised at the time to start learning about design patterns, which was just a term for me that was something you learn in school and it's really hard to understand and blah blah blah, but really they are useful. You might not think so and they might scare you away, but they are actually very simple and really useful. So we started to naming our classes with the design pattern that were mostly fitting in. So a facade could be a pattern that anything can fit in, but it's not really the purpose. A facade is just a higher abstraction of something. So as I said here, login. What do you need to do for login? You need probably to get the user from the database, you need to validate that the user exists, and you need to do a bunch of stuff. This is why this is a facade and it's called login. It does many things and I think it makes sense. So the next thing is, if you do login via social, you might have some different strategies that do the same thing but in a different way. So you might want to log in via Facebook, Google, Twitter, you might add new providers in the future. So it's really easy to understand that. I don't want to go into details, but we have many more. We have query services, commands, factories, and so on. So another thing, so let me rewind a bit and go back to the reset password example, where you saw the big action, and there are, I think, 3 of them in that file. Look at how we solve this. So this is the single responsibility principle I was talking about. So this is a service. It has only one public method, so there is only one public method per class, and we usually stick to a naming convention. So ours is called handle for facades, and we have others for other design patterns. So the reset password facade service, the sole purpose of this service is actually not the one that sends the email, it's the one that when you click on the link in the email, you need to enter a password and submit. So this is the other one, and this one, essentially what it takes in is a token and a password, right? You need a token and a new password to set the new password in, and this is all it does. This is the sole purpose of this class. So one responsibility, one functionality. This is all a class is supposed to do. One more thing to mention here, the dependency of this class. Notice here that I have just 2 dependencies, and the dependency is get the user, so fetch user query service, and reset password command service. So once you get the user, I reset the password. So this is actually the next big pattern that we learned when our new CTO came in, and it's called CQRS. So CQRS, when you have the need to do something with your data, their database or any storage mechanism that you use, you probably have a repository. This is the way the Symfony 2 does it. And I believe the repository, if I remember correctly, because I haven't used it for so long, okay, it's the manager. So from the repository you get the data, and with the entity manager you persist. Something like that, but you can even call the entity manager to get the data, if I recall correctly. Anyway, the core belief underneath CQRS is that it's it can be very complicated like DDD, but the one thing that we took out from it, it's that it's essentially splitting your model. So the part of the model view controller that you would see, it would split it in 2 parts. So one would be querying, so fetching data from the database, and the other one would be writing. So we never mix the 2. We would never use a command to get data and write, but we would just use a command to write. So you would do the get and write in a facade that it's a bit earlier, as you saw. So just quickly to go through this, query service for us is really simple. So we have single purpose services. So as you saw that fetch users, it's getting you the users. If you had another one that would get you the blog comments, you would say get comments. And that one is using a repository, which is just a bit of an abstraction up on the database. We use DBAL from Doctrine, by the way, to access the database, and that then returns back to the user. So this one is really simple. The command service, on the other way, if you recall the example of previously, I had a facade service, and this was the reset password. So on the reset password facade service, I do some kind of validation. It doesn't look like it, but I essentially see that the token is actually valid. I could even abstract it in a validation service, which we also do, but for this purpose, because it makes it so simple and I don't need to do some crazy validation like validate a whole entity of attributes, I just need to validate that a token is valid and it's in the database. This is why sometimes we choose to do things very simply. We don't complicate with more abstractions. So the purpose of the facade service is to validate the event, and then when it's sure that the event can be processed, it sends it to the command service. What the command service does, it's preparing the event. So it's probably what our command service will do. So a password is submitted in plain text. We need to hash it. This is what we do in the command service. And what it then does, it prepares it up and it just dispatches the event. It does nothing. So it's over. This is where it all ends in our first flow. It pushes the event to a stream. So now what we do next? We handle everything like Symfony does with event listeners. So we might have an event listener where we do have an event listener that saves the new password to the database, obvious. The next one would be, we could very easily now attach an email listener that just says, hey, send the email to a user notifying that somebody changed the password. That might be useful. And you might even do a notifier. You might send it into Slack, and it's completely decoupled, right? This whole purpose of this one is to listen to events and send them to Slack. Sole purpose of this is to send an email, and sole purpose for this is save it to DB. It's still single purpose, right? We don't mix any functionality with nothing, which is really great. So I talked about architecture, and now let me tell you a bit about performance. So you might think that all of this complexity comes with a bit of overhead. Well, actually, let's analyze how the request response journey looked like previously when we had the old architecture. So we still have this overhead of Symfony, which is fine. It's not that bad. It's really coded well, and it's not taking too long unless you have something really complex going on, which we don't. So what you would do, there is something, well, I don't want to mention this, but there are some conversions and stuff that maybe it's not that heavy, but then if you need to save something, you call the ORM. And that's slow. That's really slow. If you want to do it for one thing, it's not problematic. If you want to do it for 10 things, you might have problems. If you want to have 100 or 1,000 requests in a minute, it will really bottle up. The next thing, if you were in an API environment, you probably want to read it back and you want to serialize it. And as he mentioned previously, serialization is really no easy task. If you want to do it at every request, it will really kill your machine. So the way that we tackle it with this thing is that we still do have a controller. It's just that in our mind, the controller is no longer a place where everything happens. It's just another layer to get you into the domain and where you want to go. So if I just get back to the analogy I was doing before, where you essentially got into the hospital and you are suddenly in the place you need to do everything, no. Now your controller essentially tells you, the controller acts as a nurse. It tells you, okay, let me see your case. So what we essentially do is we collect all the data from the request in the controller, which means that everything that came from a request object we convert into a form that can be then passed forward to a service. So there is no longer the need to have a very, well, we can move stuff into services essentially. So in this way, if you get a picture of the hospital, the nurse is going to direct you to first one doctor who's going to take your blood out, then she's going to, or somebody else will tell you what you need to do next, and so on, until you are ended with your procedure. So this is what we try to accomplish here. It's essentially a clear layer of single-purpose stuff that gets you from request to response in a pretty good way. So let me give you just a quick example of our performance, and it might not be as good as yours, but there is a catch. So most of our requests, as you can see, this is, by the way, the last week, and we had some bugs. This is why this is so high. But the thing is, one thing that I'm going to tell you. So first thing, this is in PHP 5.6. We are looking up to upgrade, but we still have some dependencies. And the next thing is, none of this is cached. We have no cache. We don't. It's not because we haven't thought about cache, it's just that simply don't need it, not at least now. We do everything we do it straight from the database. So this is mostly under 100 milliseconds requests that are not even cached. And if you look at the RPMs, these are our requests per minute. It really depends on the time. We have even points where there are lots of users on the site, and you have even 2,000 requests per minute, which is kind of still less than 150 per second, but it's still sufficing. So if we were to add caching to this request and we add PHP-7, I think we'll get really, really low. So yeah, and just quickly to wrap up everything, I'll just tell you a bit about what we learned about Symfony and what we are actively using. The whole company is, so if you see routing that I mentioned, security is the firewall, the option resolver is a really good component. If you don't know about it, please take a look. And there is really a big list of nifty tools. There is a lot more that I didn't put here. So the thing that we are not using, and this is something that probably most of you already know about, is the ORM. So the ORM is not this evil component. It's really good for patching up something quickly and doing your block controller in, I don't know, a day or less. It will help you out with that greatly. But when you need to scale, when you need to build up, when you need to have a bigger team, this is not going to stand. The only thing that is really good about the ORM, though, and it's not just the ORM, it's coupled with the ORM, is the Doctrine Migrations bundle. And that one has a really good schema migration tool that lets you really easily automate everything when you need to upgrade your database schema. So we still use this for the schema, but for literally nothing else. And to just wrap up and go back to now show you how our code looks like instead of the false user bundle, which we, by the way, were using up to 2 years ago, and then we refactored. So this is actually the third try. This is not the second one. But yeah, the controller moved away, and we are going to the domain. So essentially what's happening now, you have one registration controller, one register action. What's happening in this two line is just getting the data from the request, right? The request, and we get the result data. I don't want to get into the details of this, but this is just getting all the attributes that you put into the post, and what's doing then is just calling the Symfony 2 service and passing in the payload. What happens next, we just return a response. That's it, done. So this is how I believe controllers should look like. They should just be there for getting up data from the requests and moving away from the controller. You go forward to the service. So that's it. Thank you. Questions? Second.
Yeah.
No questions? Go ahead.
How do the bottom layers look like? So because you don't use ORM, right?
Yeah.
So how do you pass data around? Because in ORM
Yes.
I'm used
Yes.
to having a single object and just
Yes.
passing it
So
around.
currently we do that with arrays, and we use the option resolver to validate it when it's passed around. That it's not the best idea possible, and I really am looking forward to do an improvement of that as well. The only problem with that, yeah, I guess it looks like it's an overhead. I think actually it's much faster because arrays do not have pointer in memory. They are destroyed straight away. So yeah, we do it with arrays for now, but we might use objects in the future, but it would be really simple objects, which with just DTOs, data transfer objects, are simple. But yeah, for now it's still arrays. Good question. Anything else? No? Okay, I hope I didn't scare anyone. Thank you.